Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Yoma Daf Pei continues discussing the halachos of the minimum sizes of the Isser to eat and drink on Yom Kippur. The Gemara will first make observations about the fact that the size of eating for Yom Kippur is different than the standard size all around Shas. The Gemara will give a couple of sources for that and compare it to other halachos. Then the Gemara will talk about the size of drinking, and then refer to the time that these sizes refer to. How quickly do you have to eat these sizes in order for it to count as eating? So first of all, the Gemara says that Rebbe says all over Shas, the share of everything is always a kizayis. So whenever anything has to be eaten and any to be mekayim mitzvah or to violate an aver is always a kizayis, the size of an olive, except two places where they're different, and that is the minimum amount to eat on Yom Kippur to violate the Irsa Kares, and the minimum amount of tumas oichlin to eat to make a person tameh from eating tameh foods. Now the Gemara says that the proof that actually the reason why there's a different shear here that Chazal give, that the Chachamim give, is because the pasuk in describing the Yisr uses different language. And the proof that there's a connection between the fact that they have different sizes and the Torah's different words is from Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur proves to tumas ochlin that the language is different, is what causes the shear to be different. Where do you see that the language is different on Yom Kippur? The Torah doesn't say it's usher to eat. The Torah says it's usher to not be afflicted. You got to be afflicted. Chazal gave a different shear. They give the shear koseves. That proves that as far as tumas ochlin, where the language is kol ha'ochel asher yeyochel asher yave olav mayim yitum chol mashka asher yisasa b'chol kli yitma. It says ha'ochel asher yeyochel. All the food which shall be eaten. That's a strange language. Usually just says asher yochal, anything that you eat. But here it says all the food that will be eaten. That different language teaches me that it's a different size, and it's not a standard size, which is that of a kizayis. It's the size of an egg. Now the Gemara says, why do I need a proof from Yom Kippur to show that there's a connection between the different language of the pasuk and the different shear of Chazal? The Gemara says, because you may think that ochel asher yochel is not so strange, or not such a strange language, and it's not related to the fact that it's a different size of an egg. And therefore you got to show me from Yom Kippur that there's a relationship between the two, and therefore we learn from Yom Kippur to tumas ochlin. Now the Gemara says, where do we exactly know that the shear of tumas ochlin is an egg? So the Gemara says, ha'ochel asher yochel means food from food, food which comes from food. That's what it's referring to. An egg is food which comes from a chicken, which is food. So therefore, it's food which comes from food, and that's what it counts. The Gemara says, chicken egg is the only food which comes from a food. What about a goat? A goat is food, and it comes from a mother goat, which is also food. And he says, no, it's not food. It's not food, and the mother's not food. It has to be shechted before it could be considered food, and the mother has to be shechted, slaughtered before it could be considered food. So the Gemara says, what about a ben pekua? Ben pekua doesn't have to be shechted. Ben pekua is an animal which is born from a slaughtered animal. It means you slaughter the mother, and you open up its womb, and you find that there's a goat in there. So the slaughtering of the mother counts as the slaughtering of the baby, and therefore both are slaughtered. So Gemara says, no, but still you can't eat the baby. You have to kill the baby first. You can't eat it while it's alive, midrabanan, and therefore it's still not considered food. It's still not ready to eat. So Gemara says, okay, so we know it's an egg, but who says it's a chicken egg? Maybe it's the egg of a bar yochni, which is a tremendous, gigantic egg. It's much bigger than you're giving. So Gemara says, we have a rule to fast them beruba to fast. You don't go for the bigger size thing, you go for the smaller size thing. So Gemara says, so maybe it's an egg of a tiny sparrow. How do you know it's an egg of a chicken? So this is Rabbi Avo, who said this over in the name of his Rabbi Elazar. So Rabbi Avo said on his own, the standard size of eating is the standard throatful. And a throatful is a chicken egg. That's when we say ha'ochel asher yochel, that's what we mean. The standard amount that you eat in one shot. And that's an egg size. And that's what Chachamim were Meshayir is the egg size. Now the Gemara says an interesting related halacha. The Gemara says somebody who eats chaylev in our days, we know that you can't bring a carbon to atone for doing an isser that has kares, because there's no Beis HaMikdash anymore. The Gemara says you're supposed to keep a record of all the karbanos that you owe. So when the Beis HaMikdash will be built, hopefully today or tomorrow, you'll have a record of how many karbanos chatas you owe. So the Gemara says if you're going to keep a record, if you ate chaylev by mistake, So you have to write down the oa korban chatas for that. But you shouldn't just write I oa chatas. You should write how much chaylev you ate, because it could be when the Beis Hamikdash will come, the basin in those days will change the size. The Gemara uses the phrase yarbe b'shiur, and it'll make more of the sizes, and therefore you'll have to bring different amounts. So the Gemara says, what does that mean? Make more of the sizes. The Gemara first assumes that it means make more of the sizes means that they'll have a smaller shear, and therefore you'll owe more karbanos, because you might think that the size you ate is not enough to be a mechayev a carbon, but they'll tell you no, that small, the shear is actually smaller than you thought, and therefore the amount you ate is enough to be a mechayev a carbon. We call this make more of the shear because it'll make more karbanos with a smaller shear. So the problem with that is that you wouldn't be chayev to bring the carbon anyway, because the halacha is you're only chayev to bring a carbon if, had you known it was chaylev, you would not have eaten it. But here, had you known it was chaylev, you would not have withdrawn from eating it, because it's not the shear. You would not be shov midi asay. Now, you wouldn't have eaten l'chadchila, but you would not have known that you would be violating the iser that gets kares by eating it specifically. So the Gemara says that can't be what it means. What it means is that maybe the Beis Din will have a bigger shear, and you'll think you owe a carbon, and they'll tell you no, it's got to be a bigger shear. The amount you ate is not enough to be a mechayev a carbon, and therefore you have to write down how much exactly you ate. Don't just write down that you owe a carbon, or else you'll bring a carbon, which is not correct. Halachically, you will not have to bring that carbon. Okay, now the Gemara quotes Rabbi Yechanan. It says shiurin, sizes and punishments are halachah Moshe Sinai. Gemara says halachah Moshe Sinai. The Onshin, it says specifically what punishment is for what averas. Gemara says it means to say the sizes that actually earns the punishment. That is halachah Moshe Sinai. And others say that it was brought back by the Beis Din of Yavetz. That's Osniel ben Kenaz who brought these halachas. Gemara says he brought these halachas. He can't bring new halachas. Once the Torah was giving out, add halachas. What it means is that these are among the halachas that were forgotten, and Osniel ben Kenaz were able to relearn them with his pulpul and remind us of what those halachas were supposed to be. The Gemara now moves into the minimum size of liquids to be drunk to violate the Yisr, and that'll take us to a discussion as to whether these sizes are relative per person or they are specific, one size for everybody. So the size that's given in the Mishnah for the minimum size to drink is a mouthful. So the Gemara says a mouthful. Rav Yehuda says in the name of Shmuel, not exactly a mouthful, it means a cheekful. It means if you put all the liquids you can fit in your mouth into one side and it fills up one cheek, it looks like he has a full mouth, so that's how much it is. So Gemara says, but our Mishnah didn't say a cheekful, our Mishnah said a mouthful. Gemara says as if a mouthful, that it looks like a mouthful, that his cheeks are stretched out, his cheeks are blown up, so it looks like a cheekful. So now the Gemara quotes a Mishnah that has 4 opinions, and we're going to ask that we have to fit with Beis Hillel's opinion, because halacha is always like Beis Hillel. And Beis Hillel doesn't seem to fit with this. So what does the Mishnah say? The Mishnah says, how much does a person have to drink in order to be chayev, to violate the Isser, and get kares in Yom Kippur? Beis Shammai says it's a revius. Beis Hillel says it's a mouthful. Rabbi Yehuda says the name of Rabbi Elazar, it is as if a mouthful, meaning a cheekful. And Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira says it's one swallow. So Gemara says, so you see here, Beis Hillel says a mouthful. So Gemara says, well, what's your kasha? We said our Mishnah also says a mouthful, and we said it means a cheekful. So here also a mouthful means a cheekful. Gemara says the kasha is that Rabbi Elazar said a cheekful. So how could Beis Hillel be meaning a cheekful if Rabbi Elazar has a different opinion and he says a cheekful? Gemara says no, there's a difference between the two types of cheekful. Do we mean a stretched cheekful or a loose cheekful? According to Beis Hillel, even if it's just a loose cheekful, you're violating Yisr. According to Rabbi Eliezer, it has to be a stretched cheekful. So Gemara says, hold on a second. If Beis Hillel here, when they say mouthful, they mean a cheekful, then that's smaller than a revius. That means that when Beis Shammai said a revius, Beis Shammai was being more lenient. They said you don't violate the Yisr until you drink a whole revius. Beis Hillel says just a cheekful. That's less than a revius. That means that Beis Hillel is more machmir. Now we have a list in a Mishnah, Maseches Idias, of all the times that Beis Hillel is more machmir, and this is not on the list. It can't be that Beis Hillel is more machmir. So the Gemara says, no, not a problem. We were talking about a giant. We're talking about Oig Melech HaBashan. We're talking about a very big person. That was what they were discussing. And Beis Hillel said a cheekful, which is more than a revius, and therefore he's more mekel than Beis Shammai, who says that he violates it even if it's just a revius. So then the Gemara says, what is pshat? As far as drinking, it's individual for each person. It's his own cheekful or mouthful. And as far as eating, it's one set amount to everybody, a koseves. The Gemara says because Chazal knew that the amount to violate the Isser is the amount that puts your mind at ease. You don't feel starved anymore. So Chazal knew, and Chazal said, and the rule is that everybody feels they don't feel starved when they've eaten a koseves. It's the same for everybody, but how much drink you need, that depends on each individual. Bigger people need more drink in order to have that feeling of affliction be removed from them. So Gemara says, how can it be? Everybody has a koseves. Everybody feels better with a koseves. Ogmel chaboshan, a giant will feel better from the same koseves that some little shrimp will feel better. So Gemara says, yes, they'll both feel better. Different levels. Ogmel chaboshan will feel a little bit better. Somebody who's much smaller will feel much better, but they will still have that feeling of rafchas, that feeling of ease from eating that amount. So now the Gemara asks, similarly, it should at least depend what they're eating. If you're eating some nice gishmak fatty meat, so a koseves could make you feel much better, but if you're eating palm leaves, don't tell me that gives you the same feeling as if you're eating fatty meat. So the Gemara says, no. Well, no matter what you're eating, if you're eating a koseves size, it'll make you feel better. If it's good meat, it'll make you feel a lot better. If it's not good meat, if it's palm leaves, it'll make you feel a little bit better, but both qualify as making you feel better, and therefore both violate the Isser. So now the Gemara says, now how fast do you have to eat it? So the rule is that anything, in order to be considered eaten, has to be eaten within the amount of time it takes to eat half a loaf of bread, what's called a kedei achilas pras. So Gemara says, is it true that for all halachas it's kedei achilas pras? For eating on Yom Kippur a koseves, which is a big shear, is kedei achilas pras, and for other yisurim that the shear is a concise size of an olive, which is much smaller, that's also a kedei achilas pras. How could different sizes be for different things? Gemara says, yes, because the rule generally is that qualifies in eating, it has to be kedei achilas pras, and a concise and a kedei achilas pras counts as eating. As far as how much you have to eat, how fast on Yom Kippur to feel better, a koseves and a kedei achilas pras, that makes you feel better. Now the Gemara says, well, I have another kasha. In order for a person to become tamei enough to the extent that he's not allowed to eat truma anymore, he has to eat what's called a half pras of tamei foods. That's when he's not allowed to eat anymore. But there also the share is a kedei achilas pras. Now, half pras is 2 eggs. That's much bigger than a kazayas. So why should it be the same size, the same amount of time for how fast he eats it if it's a much bigger size? Versus, well, that's different. There, even though it's a much bigger size, they allowed the same amount of time because it's only the rabbanon. That halacha of not being able to eat truma when you ate tamei foods is only midar Rabbanon midaraisa. The only thing that's matame you from eating truma is eating nivlas of tamei. So Gemara says that's only the Rabbanon, but we learn it out of a pasuk. It says related to sitamu b'hem v'nit meisem vam. The Torah says don't eat nevela and makes you tamei, and there's no isser for Yisrael to become tamei at all. It must be referring to this halacha. So you see it's an isser deraisa. So Gemara says no, that's a hint. The halacha is only the Rabbanon, and that's what's called an asmachta. It's a hint of that halacha, but it's not the real source. Now the Gemara moves into the halacha of combining food and drink. We've seen in our Mishnah that food and drink do not combine to one share. So the Gemara says that Rav Papa says if you eat meat with salt on it, the salt combines with the meat to make a minimum share, even though salt is not food, but because people always eat them together, therefore it does count towards the share. Now Rish Lakish says if you have sauce on your vegetables, that counts towards the share, koseves, the share for food. The Gemara says, what's a chiddush? Chiddush is you may think sauce is a liquid, it's a drink, and therefore it doesn't count towards the share koseves, which is the share for food. This comes to teach us that anything which is eaten together with food as part of the food dish does count, even if it's a liquid. It's a drink that doesn't count towards food. Now the Gemara discusses situations in which you're not chayav, it doesn't count as eating. Rish Lakish says somebody who eats achila gasa, that means he's eating on top of being stuffed full. That means it's right at the beginning of Yom Kippur. He filled himself up before Yom Kippur, and now he's eating on top of that. So that doesn't count as eating. It doesn't have the halacha of eating. It counts as destroying. He's destroying the food and he's hurting himself. So he doesn't violate the Issa Karis, doesn't get Karis for that. Similarly, we know that the halacha is that somebody who eats truma has to pay for the truma, and he also has to add a fifth of the value and pay to the Kohen that he took it from. If he's a Yisrael. So that's only true if he eats it and it counts as real eating. Somebody eats it as a chilagasa, eats it and when he's full, that counts as destroying it. He didn't destroy it, he didn't eat it, he destroyed it, he doesn't have to pay the extra fifth, he just has to pay the value of the truma because he destroyed the Kohen's truma. Similar halacha is if somebody eats it in a non-edible way, he chews up raw kernels. That's not called eating. He didn't do an eating. It doesn't count as the pasuk which says, "Ish ki yochal kodesh b'shkago v'yosef chamishi soyolav." If he eats kodesh by accident, it's got to be that he actually ate it, and that's not called eating, and therefore he only has to pay the value, not the extra chomesh. Now the Gemara discusses what happens if two people actually eat the same food. What does that mean? Somebody swallows a plum whole, a truma plum, and then he coughs it up, spits it out, and somebody else eats it. So first person swallowed it whole, the Gemara says that counts as real eating. and therefore he has to pay the value and the chumash. But once he swallowed it and spit it back out, it's not food anymore. And the second person who eats it doesn't count as eating anything. Not only that, he doesn't have to pay truma to the owner anymore because it now belongs to the first person who ate it. He took ownership of it by swallowing it. So he just has to pay that person for what he stole from him. But what did he steal from him? It's not considered food anymore, so he didn't steal food from him. It's just firewood, and therefore he just has to pay him for the firewood value of the plum that he went ahead and...
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.